So what does the word prompt actually mean? Now we talk a lot about prompt engineering, and we're talking about interaction with large language models. And so let's dive into this word a little bit because I want to give you a sense of the depth of what a prompt can be. It's more than just a question that you're asking to the large language model. So to do this, I think it's helpful to go through a couple of prompts and actually interact with ChatGPT to understand the concept of a prompt and sort of the dimensions to a prompt. So I started off here by just asking ChatGPT, what does the word prompt mean? And it comes up with some really helpful, I think, information for us to use when we're talking about prompts. One, it says it's a verb to cause or encourage someone to do something, to spur them to action. And it says, example, the teacher's reminder about the upcoming exam prompted the students to start studying. So part of what a prompt is, it is a call to action to the large language model. It is something that is getting the large language model to start generating output for us. Basically to start generating words that will form the basis of our output. And those words could take all kinds of different formats. It could be software, defining the instructions in a program. It could be the words that we need for that. It could be words in a poem. It could be words in many, many different types of things. We could do it as structured data that we need. All of these things are possible, but the key is the prompt is basically our way of getting the large language model to begin to provide some output for us. The second thing it says is it's an adjective. It's done without delay, on time. And this is an important thing to think about with large language models is we're prompting them right now, do this. But this is also a useful point of discussion because a prompt doesn't necessarily, depending on how you work with it, have to be something that happens right now. Prompts can have time associated with them. And now we have a little bit of an illusion of time, and I'll talk about this later in the course, but when we give prompts to the large language model like ChatGPT, the prompt could affect what's happening right now in my next statement that I give it, or in the current statement, or it could affect something in the future. And this is because of some of the conversational capabilities of these large language models. Now, we're going to talk about prompts themselves as conversations later on. But for now, the way to think about it is a prompt doesn't just have to be something that's immediate. It can be, but it doesn't have to be. The next thing it says is a prompt can be a noun, a cue or reminder that helps someone remember what they were supposed to do or say. Now this is important because we can use prompts to remind the large language model of information or of things that it needs to do. And so we may be asking it to do something now. We may be asking it something to do in the future, in which case it needs to remember something. So we need to give it a reminder of what it's trying to do. We may need to go back and give it a history of the conversation, of things that have happened, other things that'll help it remember what it's trying to do. And then it can be another noun, a message or screen that appears on a computer or electronic device asking the user for input. So this is kind of a helpful thing because we can prompt the large language model to produce things for us, but the large language model, if we structure things correctly, can actually elicit information from the user. So the large language model can ask questions to us. So a prompt can both serve as a call to action or to spurring the large language model to action, or it can actually be an input. It can be asking us for input. So the last output from the large language model could have been a question for the human, and basically we are then providing information back to it. So prompts have a lot of different dimensions to them, and if you actually look at the definition of prompt, in fact the definition that ChatGPT gives us, it gives us sort of that nuance to the capabilities of a prompt. Now I've gone on a little bit here, and I'm going to give you an example of this time aspect to a prompt because I think this helps to see the complexity and dimensionality of this concept. I'm going to say from now on, when I ask a question, suggest a better version of my question and ask me if I would like to use it. So right here, I'm starting off by saying from now on, I'm attaching time to my prompt. So it's not just immediate. And we get a response, sure, I can do that. However, I will start out to ask you the original question to the best of my ability, and it goes on to try to reframe this original question, which wasn't what I necessarily needed. But then I say, what color is the sky? Now notice we're done, right? We asked, the original prompt was back here. I said from now on when I ask a question, and it immediately gave us a response because of that prompt. But now I'm going to ask a follow-on question, but the earlier prompt is going to affect this question. So right now I'm asking it something immediate, what color is the sky? And it responds with a possible better version of the question could be, what is the scientific explanation for the blue color of the sky during the daytime? Would you like me to use this version instead? And then I say yes. Now notice here we have a lot of those different dimensions of a prompt that we talked about. Up here, we are creating a prompt that isn't just immediate. It is going to affect us in the future. It's going to continue to influence the output of the large language model. So we can have immediate prompts that right now, right at this moment, do something, but we can also have prompts that span time. And in this case, that's what we're doing. We're creating something from now on, go and do this. Now we're going to have an immediate prompt, which is what color is the sky? We're asking this right now. And now our earlier prompt that we provided that was spanning time is now impacting the way that the large language model responds to our questions. So now what's happening is it's taking our current immediate question, what color is the sky, but it's using the context that we had previously said to suggest better versions of all of our questions and then ask us if we'd like to use them to generate its output. And its output is, here's a better question. What is the scientific explanation for the blue color of the sky during daytime? And you can see how that really is a better question than my first question. My first question was sort of vague, didn't provide enough context, and now it's giving us a more specific question that truly is better, and that's because of this prompt that we attached some time to it. We said from now on, and so it's influencing what's said now. The other thing that we can see is we talked about a prompt being something that can elicit information from the user. And so now we're seeing that the ChatGPT, in this case, the large language model, is asking us for information. It's prompting us. It's soliciting information, and it's saying, would you like me to use this version of the question instead? So now we've got that extra dimension of a prompt, it soliciting information from us, and we say yes. And then it goes and answers the question. And it says, great, to answer your revised question, the blue color of the sky during the daytime is due to a phenomena called Rayleigh scattering, or Rayleigh scattering. And I apologize, I don't know this term, and I'm actually learning something from ChatGPT as I read this. The Earth's atmosphere is composed of various gases and particles that scatter sunlight in all directions. Blue light has a shorter wavelength and higher frequency than other colors, which causes it to scatter more easily in the atmosphere. This results in the blue color that we see when we look up at the sky on a clear day. Now, we've seen a lot of different dimensions to prompts through this short interaction. We've seen creating time prompts that span longer. We then see an immediate prompt that's spurring the large language model to action. We see the concept of the large language model prompting and getting input from us. And then we see the output of all of this. Now, one of the things to note is we also talked about memory, that the prompt had a source of a concept of sort of memory to it. And we'll talk about how this works in the future, but right here I say from now on when I ask a question. That's something that the large language model has to remember in the future interactions. And we'll see how it actually does this. And so then when I say what color is the sky, it's remembering that I said to whenever I ask a question, ask a better version of a question. And then it's responding right here with the better version of the question. And then if I go and I do this again, we'll see that it still remembers my original statement that it needs to suggest better versions of my question. So I said, how many countries are there in the world? And it says a better version of your question would be, what is the current estimated number of countries in the world and how is a country defined? Would you like me to use this version instead? And then I say yes. and then says, great, as of my knowledge cut off in September 2021, there were 195 recognized sovereign states or countries in the world. However, this number may vary depending on how a country is defined. The United Nations, for example, has 193 member states, while other organizations and countries may recognize different numbers. Generally, a country is defined as a sovereign state with its own government, territory, and international recognition. Now, one other interesting thing that we talked about is that a prompt has some memory associated with it, and this also shows us some of the limitations that the large language model's knowledge cuts off in September 2021. So one of the other things that we may need to do for the large language model is we may need to remind it of what has happened since it was finished being trained, and we can use a prompt to provide information to the large language model like ChatGPT about what happened after it was trained. So we can also use it to provide information that the large language model didn't have access to when it was trained, like our own private information or other things. Now, of course, you have to be cognizant that when you're using ChatGPT or many of these other tools, you're actually sending information to their servers. So you do want to make sure that that is something that you're willing to do before doing this. But if you're using a large language model locally on your machine, or you're willing to send the information, you can provide information that it doesn't have access to in order to reason about. So a prompt can also be about providing information to one of these language models. So if we look at this example and we say, what was Vanderbilt University's acceptance rate in 2020, it should have access to that. And so it provides this information. It says the acceptance rate was 9.6%. If we say, what was Vanderbilt University's acceptance rate in 2022, it'll say, I'm sorry, but it doesn't have access to that information because it was cut off in 2021. If we then provide it that information, so here I'm cutting and pasting the admissions data that was released and published by Vanderbilt just a few days ago, so it clearly didn't have access to this. If I now provide this to it in a prompt, then it says, based on the information you provided, it appears that Vanderbilt University's acceptance rate for the regular decision applicants of the class of 2026 was 4.7%. So a prompt can also serve as a way of providing new and updated information to the large language model like we saw in this example. Let's talk intuitively about what a pattern, what a prompt is doing, and how the patterns in the prompt sort of tap into the capabilities of a large language model. And sort of, I think looking at some examples will help to give you a sense of how your prompts are really affecting and eliciting different behaviors from the underlying large language model that you're interacting with. So let's take a look at this example. I want to start off by talking about pattern. Pattern's really important. Remember, as we talked about, large language models are trained to basically predict the next word. They're constantly trying to predict the next word based on what came before. So you give it a sentence and it's trying to predict the next word. And then it's taking that and adding it and trying to predict the next word, and over and over and over. And so it was trained on large pieces of the internet trying to predict the next sentence. So one of the things that it's learning to do is to recognize patterns that tell it what the next word should be. That's basically what it's doing. Now, this is a really simple example of this concept. I'm going to tell ChatGPT, complete this story, and I start with, Mary had a little, and I stop. Now, if you know the nursery rhyme, it's Mary had a little lamb, its fleece was white as snow. And you can imagine that this story showed up over and over and over and over in the data that ChatGPT was trained on. So when I say Mary had a little, that is a very powerful pattern that ChatGPT has seen many, many, many times. And so it immediately tries to pick up with lamb, its fleece is white as snow, and everywhere that Mary went, the lamb was sure to go. So that pattern was seen so many times that ChatGPT, when I put in the first part of it, it immediately responds with the next part of the sentence. It knows where to pick up. So one thing we have to think about is if we know the right patterns, if we can tap into things that the model has been trained on and seen over and over and over again, we'll be more likely to not only get a consistent response, so we're going to consistently get a particular completion of Mary Had a Little because it's been seen so many times in the training data. We're going to get more consistency, but we're also going to more likely get a particular sort of ability to tap into it, to unlock it. Like if we want a particular behavior, we want to have the right pattern that we're tapping into. Now, let's look at what happens if we change the pattern a bit. And so I say, rather than, Mary had a little, I say, complete this story. A girl named Mary had a microscopic. Now, this isn't the pattern that it was trained on anymore, right? And it says, a girl named Mary had a microscopic friend named Max. Max was so small, you could only see him through a microscope. Despite his size, he had a big personality and was always eager to go on adventures with Mary. One day, Mary decided to take Max on a trip to the local pond. She carefully placed him on a lily pad. Now, one of the interesting things is you can imagine that when you start talking about microscopic, that you can think about there's probably descriptions of going to a pond and doing science with a class of students. I mean, I almost have a vision of it reading stories about students getting samples of pond water and looking at them under a microscope. But the important thing is you notice that Mary Had a Little created a very, very specific response, whereas a girl named Mary Had a microscopic creates a much different response. And then if we go and rerun this, we get something completely different. Pet named Max. Max was a tiny creature that lived in a small jar. And so, this pattern isn't as strong. There are words in this pattern that are strong and sort of give context that help to shape the story. But the pattern itself is not as strong as Mary Had a Little. So doing it again, whereas the other story changed completely, I'm still getting the same completion with this. I'm still getting lamb, its fleece was as white as snow. So every time I'm getting a very consistent, response to this pattern. So one of the things to think about when you're writing a pattern or writing a prompt is what patterns do I have in my prompt, and what patterns will that probably tap into that the large language model was trained on. So if there's a very strong pattern in the prompt, you're more likely to get a response to that pattern. On the other hand, if that's not a pattern that it was trained on, it's not as clear, then you're going to have other things that are going to matter, like specific words. So a microscopic is going to that word is fundamentally going to change the behavior of this prompt because it's such a strong word. A girl named Mary is sort of generic. There were probably lots of stories with a girl named Mary. But microscopic, it has all of this feeling and implications to it, and that's going to then influence the large language model's output. Specific words alone, because of the patterns around those words, like microscopic is always going to be talked about in the context of small things probably. Or maybe in terms of things like in this case, like a small creature that lived in a glass jar. That word itself has a strong sort of pattern of other words that are coming around it, but it's not as strong as the pattern Mary Had a Little. Now, one thing to note is that when you're writing prompts, you want to be really specific, or you want to provide enough detail in your words that the large language model will know the right level of detail to put into the output. So if your words are very generic and high level, then you're more likely to get an output that is also generic and high level. So if you look at this example, I say discuss Vanderbilt University, and I get a very generic sort of response. It's a private research university located in Nashville, Tennessee, founded in 1873 by Cornelius Vanderbilt, ranking, other things. Now, if I want something really specific, I need to make sure that ChatGPT has the right words and context in order to answer my question. So ChatGPT is not a mind reader. You have to give it the context. You have to give it the words that are going to elicit the right response. If I go back and I say, discuss Vanderbilt University with respect to Kirkland Hall, it's a specific building on campus, then it changes the output. I get a much more specific output. I get Vanderbilt University, private research university located in Nashville, Tennessee. Now we notice we're getting this fairly consistently, both of them. So that's probably pattern that or information that the model was trained on and saw over and over again on different web pages for Vanderbilt and different documents. And then it cues in on the Kirkland Hall, and it starts discussing Kirkland Hall is one of the most iconic buildings on Vanderbilt University campus, named after James H. Kirkland. It then talks about Kirkland Hall, Kirkland Hall, Kirkland Hall. And so we've now completely changed the output. Now, even though we had shared a common beginning, we got a much more targeted output. And the key to this was that we added in specificity into our prompt about what we wanted, the details. So if you think about asking it to write something or to analyze something, it's always helpful when you say with respect to, and give it very specific words or names or things that you want it to then use to trigger the output. Because what we see is this Kirkland Hall is a very powerful word that then gets woven into the whole discussion. It's a powerful name of a building. If we just say generically, at a high level, we don't use specific words, we don't use a specific context, we're going to get very generic stuff. And this is probably stuff that if you go and look at descriptions on Wikipedia, descriptions on Vanderbilt's web pages, this is like the most common types of information that you see. So in order to break out of the mold of what is common, you need to inject the more specific ideas that you want in the output, or you need to inject patterns that will help tap into those more specific things. So this is an important aspect in that if you just use it and you ask it generic questions, you're going to get generic answers. If you ask it average questions and average things, you will get average answers. To really use it powerfully, you have to use your own creativity and thought to get specific about details, aspects of what you want discussed, and think about what are the right patterns to put into your prompt in order to trigger the behavior that you want, like we saw in this Mary Had a Little Lamb. Or we might want to do the opposite. We might know that we're going to get a very generic response because certain things have been seen a lot. And so we need to come up with tricks or patterns or specific words that will help break us out of those patterns that we're seeing in the trading data so that we can get something that's more of what we want. So we don't want to be trapped into the completion of Mary Had a Little Lamb. So we go and add specific words like microscopic and a girl named Mary so that it's not so strong, so that we're not directly getting into that pattern. So just changing the wording can help us escape the patterns or get into the patterns depending on what we want. And then when we get output, the more generic our language, typically the more generic the output, the more specific our language, the more specific the output. And if we want certain things in that output, we need to make sure we have specific words and phrases that will tap into the specific things that we want in the output. Now, one of the other things is we're talking about output, but in the sense of a query. Like if I have specific words, it'll pull in the right information. One of the things we can also do is our prompt itself is a pattern that the large language model is learning from, and it can also tailor the output. So as we've seen in examples before, we can go in and do different things to try to affect the output. So for example, I might go in and actually, let's change this up a little bit. Let's say title, and we could say title of article, and then we could say author, and then we could say summary, and we could go in and give it something that it can look at and respond to. So now what I've done is I've gone and provided it some structure. Now it hasn't followed my structure exactly, and this is actually a failing in my prompt. I hasn't quite thought of the right structure, but I've gotten pretty close. So I went and influenced the output and the structure of the output by giving it additional pattern in my prompt itself. So one thing we can do is we can tap into patterns in order to influence the output. Another thing we can do is we can go in and use specific words and phrases to kind of be a query across or to basically collect learned information that's inside of the trained model. Another thing we can do is we can go in and we can provide information or basically new pattern that then influences the output. So in this case, I provided the structure of what I wanted and it somewhat followed it, and I could probably go and rerun this thing and get something a little better, and in this case I do. So this will be another thing that we can do is we can use our prompt to create sort of new patterns that it's trying to follow in the output. So the prompt itself can introduce new patterns or tap into them in some respects. So this is kind of creating pattern that it then is responding to as well. So when you're writing prompts, it's really important to think through this concept that it's trying to predict the next word, and it's doing that based on patterns it's learned in the past and patterns that are in the language of our prompt and patterns that are based on the word choice that we have, patterns that are based on the sort of organization, the sort of textual organization. And so those patterns can help us get a consistent response. If we have a really strong pattern that always produces a particular next token or next word, then we can rely on that. If we don't want that behavior, we can try to change our phrasing in our words so we get out of that trap. If we want to make sure certain information is pulled in, we need to create specific words or patterns that are more likely to have been seen in the context of that information that we want. If we want more generic information, then we probably need to give it more generic language or tell it that we want it to be more generic in some respect. And then finally, if we want the output to look a certain way, we need to give it sort of a sense of pattern in the output. We need to tell it about the structure. We need to give it words and patterns in our prompt that will be likely to influence the output. So you can imagine seeing title and author on an article was something that was fairly common. So if I put title and author in this way into my prompt, then it's more likely going to want to go and create title and author again and sort of replicating the pattern of what I'm showing here. So that should give you some intuition about how all of this works and some things to think about when you're going and structuring your prompts, picking words for them, picking the patterns in your language, and picking the things that you want to go into the output, how you structure and kind of explain the output to it. Prompts allow you to do more than just ask questions to ChatGPT or tell it to do things. You can actually write programs. Now, if you're not a programmer, don't worry, because everybody can actually program using ChatGPT. And I don't just mean in writing a bunch of software that you're going to run on your computer, but actually giving ChatGPT rules to follow, complex instructions that you want it to listen to and use to generate the output. Now, I'm going to give you some examples of this, hopefully give you some intuition on what I mean by programming and help you to think about how you can write better prompts. Now, one way to think about this is I'm going to talk about it in terms of programming, but you can also think about it in terms of rules that you would give, some type of personal assistant. So let's take a look at an example here. So I'm going to ask ChatGPT, whenever you generate output, turn it into a comma-separated value list. Now, this is just something that you might want to do. You want to format your data. So if you've ever worked in Excel, comma-separated values is basically a list of items separated by commas. It's a really simple concept. Now, sometimes you can think of tables as having a comma-separated value list. You can think of the first column in the table as the first value, then you have a comma that differentiates and separates the second column, and then another column is separated with a comma. So you can basically have like a 3-column table. You can have the first value and then a comma and then the second value and then a comma and then a third value. And if you've ever worked with different spreadsheet programs, you've probably done this. So now ChatGPT says, sure, I can do that. I can output my format. So I'm going to write in, my name is Jules White and I am teaching a course on prompt engineering. And so what we can see is it creates a comma-separated value list. We're essentially creating a table there are two columns, name and course, and it decides that the first column is going to be name, is going to be me, and then the second column is going to be prompt engineering, which is my course. Now notice it decided, which is kind of interesting, it decided what the columns were going to be. I didn't tell it. But if I wanted to go back, I could maybe give it some more instructions. I could say, from now on, the columns of the comma separated value, and comma separated value is CSV, and in the future examples I'm going to start abbreviating this CSV, but I'm writing it out for now. The columns of the comma separated value list should be name, and I'm going to go ahead and capitalize these to provide some emphasis. Name, course, and role. So what is the role of the person in the course? And now I'm going to say, again, my name is Jules White, and I am teaching a course on prompt engineering. And so now we see it's reformatted. It's now got name, Jules White, course, prompt engineering, and role, teacher. And so we've actually written a program. If you think about it, what we've told ChatGPT to do is every time we actually write something, ChatGPT needs to format it in a particular structure that we've given it. We've wrote a program that tells it what to do. So it's more than just asking a question. We're actually telling it how to interpret our input. Now, we could go and write more for our program. For example, we could say, in addition to whatever I type in, generate additional examples that fit the format of the CSV that I have asked you to produce. And so now what we see is it's gone and it's taken my original format, name, course, and role, and it's now filled out additional examples. And I could say something like, my name is Jules White, and I am teaching a course on prompt engineering. And you notice now our program's gotten more complex. Not only is it creating the CSV based on what I typed in, but it's also following my instructions, and it's going through and generating additional examples that fit into this. So when you're creating prompts, you can do much more than just ask it a question and get an answer. You can actually program the interactions. Now the key to this is that we're having a conversation. And if you look back, at the very beginning, I provided it the initial sort of instructions, which whenever you generate output, turn it into a comma separated value list. And it started doing that. And then I began refining my program. I then say, from now on, at this point, I'm adding something to it. I want the columns of the comma separated value list to be name, course, and role. And then it does that. And then I say, now, in addition to that, I want you to generate examples. And it does that. And so we've actually written a program. And now whenever we go in and type in new input, so again, you notice I'm providing the same input, basically. My name is Jules White, and I'm teaching a course on prompt engineering. But the program that ChatGPT is using to produce the output is changing. I've changed the rules over and over. Now you can imagine talking to a personal assistant and you can say, okay, I want you to do X, and they do it, and then you realize, oh wait, they didn't, there's something else I want. And you give them an additional rule to follow, and then you tell them, okay, I want you to do X, and they go and do it, and they do better, but you realize, nah, it's not quite what I want. And so you go give them an additional rule to follow. And when you're doing that, you're basically building up a program for them. You're building up a set of instructions that they need to follow whenever you give them this particular task. And that's what we're doing with ChatGPT. We are programming. And so we're using the same input over and over. My name is Jules White, and I'm teaching a course on prompt engineering. We're using it here. But each time, the output that we're getting is getting different and more complex because we're asking ChatGPT to do different things. We're giving it more instructions for the program. And the final result is now we've got structured output. It's got additional examples. All of this has come from what we've asked ChatGPT to go and do.